Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming, and I have two guests for you today. I have two sisters that, as always, as guests that I have on, are doing important work that needs to be uplifted, and I'm just really, really honored. One, that they accepted the invitation, and two, that they've come on. And I think you're going to appreciate what they're doing, and you can figure out how you can help them in achieving what they're trying to do. So we're ready to get the show started, but before anything, it's time for a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. Jurors in Hunter Biden's historical criminal trial heard opening arguments and testimony from key prosecution witnesses. President Biden criticized those questioning the integrity of Donald Trump's guilty verdict in his hush money trial, labeling Trump a convicted felon and a threat if reelected. Republicans in the U.S. Senate blocked legislation to protect access to contraception. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland denied House Republicans' accusations of politicizing the justice system to hinder Donald Trump's political ambitions. President Biden implemented a broad asylum ban on migrants illegally crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. Claudia Sheinbaum won Mexico's presidential election with a historic vote percentage, becoming the country's first female president. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi secured a historic third term but lost his party's majority in parliament. Dr. Anthony Fauci testified to Congress about the harassment and threats he faced due to his pandemic stance and advocacy for vaccines. A divided U.S. appeals court ruled against the Fearless Fund's grants for Black women-owned businesses. Prosecutors in Minnesota dismissed charges against a state trooper in the 2023 shooting death of Ricky Cobb II. A Florida sheriff's office fired a deputy for the unreasonable use of deadly force in the fatal shooting of Black airman Roger Forston. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill to impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court over arrest warrants for Israeli officials. And Marion Robinson, mother of former First Lady Michelle Obama, died at the age of 86. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right, Grace, thank you for that moment of news. And now it's time for my first guest, Dr. Tiffany Manuel. Dr. Tiffany Manuel, also known as Dr. T, wants to bring joy to your justice seeking. She's challenged audiences around the country to reimagine how justice wins by adopting leadership principles that pivot around crisis fatigue, bust dominant narratives about the big issues of our day, and reframe the bedtime stories we tell ourselves about why things aren't getting better. Dr. T helps everyday leaders listen better, rally more people to their causes, and tap into their community's aspirations for a better world for all of us. A Detroit, Michigan native, Dr. T, as most people affectionately call her, grew up during one of the most turbulent times in the city's history. During her most formative years, she witnessed many types of inequality and decided to dedicate her future to combating injustice. Now she champions better policies, programs, investments, and services that can transform our cities and communities for the better. She also has worked to expand opportunity, equity, and inclusion through 25 plus years of professional and volunteer experience spanning the private and nonprofit sectors, government, and academia. Dr. T is a dynamic speaker who has appeared in news media, journals, some of the largest international conferences. She is the best-selling author of several books, most recently CaseMade, 10 Powerful Leadership Principles That Win Hearts, Change Minds, and Grow Impact. She founded and is president and CEO of TheCaseMade, a leading organization dedicated to helping leaders powerfully and intentionally make the case for systems change. She is chair of the board of directors of Shelter Force, the interim executive director of the Redress Movement, and a member of the board of trustees with Kaboom, the national nonprofit working to end childhood play inequity in communities across the country. And Rebuilding Together, an organization that organizes volunteers to repair the homes of seniors and low-income families for free. At The CaseMade, Dr. T works with hundreds of passionate social change makers, innovators, and adaptive leaders around the United States who are building better, stronger communities that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. By aligning their community stakeholders around the kind of deep systems changes that can improve population outcomes, these leaders are able to grow their impact, scale their programs, and harness the investments they need to improve their communities. In her previous roles as enterprise community partners and frameworks, Dr. T helped advance the narrative change movement and leverage ways of using data to support smarter community investment strategy. The narrative movement in particular helps justice seekers see important issues like housing, homelessness, and healthcare in a new way and leverage the evidence and data they use to make the case for innovative solutions. Trained as a social scientist in quantitative and qualitative methods, Dr. T is a self-professed data, policy, and messaging wonk. She is passionate about translating the insights harvested from her research and practice to improve our ability to build public will around the critical issues that matter most. She holds doctorate and master's degrees in public policy from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a master's degree in political science from Purdue University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. Dr. T is a lifetime member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, an African-American public service sorority. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Tiffany Manuel. All right, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, better known as Dr. T. How you doing, Doc? You doing good?
I'm doing great. Hey, now, how you doing?
I'm doing lovely. Glad to have you on. One of the things I like to do with this podcast is that there are people out here that are doing the work. I was an elected official once. So usually the elected officials get attention, whether it's at the state level, local level, or national level. But a lot of the people that are out in the communities doing the work don't get a whole lot of attention. You may get some notoriety in your circles and all that stuff, but you're not
Mm-hmm.
getting the attention. So the object of my show is to get people on a platform where more than just the inner circle or the immediate community they work in. And you're one of those folks. I've had the privilege of reading your materials and following you on LinkedIn, and you're a powerful voice, sister, and I really wanted to uplift you and give you a platform to continue to expand on that.
Well, thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Yeah. So, having set you up like that, how I start my interviews is that I give my guest a quote, and from that quote we start the discussion. So your quote is, building the public will necessary to transform the systems that shape the futures of our communities is one of the most critical challenges of our time. What does that quote mean to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's from my book, and it kind of encapsulates why I started my organization, The Case Made, and why I do the work that I do. And that's because I think, for a lot of social issues that folks want to see reflected in public policy or for the world that we're trying to create, a lot of us have been, having the policy conversations or having the detailed conversations about what it looks like, what it means, what all this other kind of stuff, and not really paying attention to people's energies, whether or not people have the strength and the will to do the work that it really takes to bring about the world that we really want to see reflected. And unless we are really focused on that, we're missing half the story. It's one thing to be saying, I want to see childcare, I want to see affordable housing, I want to see nationalized healthcare, I want to see climate, change policies in place that protect our environment. It's one thing to be saying that and be talking about the policy issues that get us there. It's another thing to be looking at, average, ordinary folks who are just trying to live their lives and saying, I know it's really tough. I know that you don't necessarily feel like you're in a position to change those things, but we have to try, right? It's another thing to be sort of matching people's energy and saying, it's rough. I get it. Life is life. And we still have to do the work to try to create a better world, not just for us, but for our children. And that means we have to try. And so, that's what I think about in terms of work I do. It's the energy work of getting people ready to do the real work of making the future that we know is possible.
So this wasn't part of what I wanted to ask, but a lot of times when a guest gives an answer, it leads to a question. And it's something I've personally been dealing with in the last couple of weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on that, how do you continue to have the energy to do what you do, right? What what is the hidden motivation to keep pressing on when you say that life is tough, right? And life is lifing, especially in this political climate. How do you personally just kind of keep that fire lit, and that button pressed, as you would say?
Yeah. So I would say, it's interesting. And in the last couple of years, I've been learning a lot more from a lot of my colleagues about this notion of Afrofuturism, which I love, love, love. I give a lot of respect for folks who are doing that work. And Afrofuturism is really about what happens for a lot of us in the African American experience, which is holding the past, present, and future in the same space. And when I think about the things that push me forward, it's holding past, present, and future in the same moment, right? And seeing the possibility of that. In terms of the past, like I don't know how, from my vantage point, how you read the histories of, particularly in African American context, all of the folks who gave so much of themselves, you can just name them all: Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Fannie Lou Hamer. I mean, you can rattle them off and just say, these folks gave so much to get us here. I can't stop that journey. I can't be the one. The baton got passed, and then to sit down and say, "Ooh, I'm so tired, I don't have time." Are you kidding me? Right? Harriet Tubman was like, you know, running around there. I mean, you just, I don't know how you get the baton and stop and sit down and say, right. And I think people have been, unfortunately, lots of folks around me and probably about both of us have been talked out of our power to keep running that race. So when I think about the past, that's important. In the present, I'm just energized by a lot of the organizers and folks on the ground in the places where I do work across the country, that folks are actively in community saying, we are going to have these conversations. We see that a better world is possible, and we're going to work toward it. I don't know how you see people in community doing that work and not say, I can help. I have skills that I can contribute to this. In this case, my skill set is about case making and how you make the case for the world that we want to see happening. I don't know how I have those skills and squirrel those away and not contribute. And then when I think about the future, I have two younger sons. I have two teenagers, two little brown boys that are in my care that the good Lord has given me. And I don't know how I look at my children in the face and not do something to make sure that the world they're going to inherit is worthy of their time, talent, and treasure. So to me, that's the whole continuum of sort of Afrofuturism, right? We as a people often hold those things together because we don't have the luxury of not looking back, because we have to explain how we got here. And the only way you can do that is to be thoughtful about history. But also, our salvation has always been in looking forward. Like there's got to be something better in the future. I mean, right? You think about all the generations of our folks. We've always said there's got to be something better. Come on, y'all. There's got to be, whether it was the promised land, whatever it is, however these people, right, talked about it. Even in this moment, I just think for my children, there just has to be something better. There has to be, right, a moment where we're not struggling so hard, right, to have people recognize the human dignity of who we are as folks. So I don't know how I stop when I'm holding those things in my hands, the past, the present, and the future.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. All right. So now let's get into, you mentioned it. What is strategic case making?
Oh, I love it. Strategic case making is about how we get really thoughtful about communicating to people why they ought to be involved. That very thing I was just talking about, right? How do we get better at communicating the very concept that there is a future that's possible, and that we are the folks to make it, and that we got to get moving. And it's hard for all the reasons I talked about. Like people get talked out of their power, right? Right. The things that happen in your life can make you feel demoralized, like there really isn't the possibility of something better. And so people get stuck. They give up trying. And so case making is about saying to folks, how do we take people's energy and change that? I say case making is about changing the energy in the rooms that we're in. We're not talking about the negativity of what has happened in the past. We're talking about the promise of what happened in the past. And that we're going after we're going after the promise, right, into the future. So it's giving people the tools that they need, right, to be able to make the case, to get people off the sidelines, right, in the social justice movement, to say we all need to be involved. Come on off the sidelines, right? There's a reason to be involved, and there's a reason to be excited. And being able to do that with a great deal of fidelity and integrity and thoughtfulness, because you recognize where people are. And what I put in the book, in the sort of the CaseMade book, is all of the skill set and the principles for how to do that, right? I think sometimes part of the reason why people don't do more in the space and policy and and social justice, because they don't feel like they have the skill set to bring other people with them. They don't feel like they have the skill set to motivate people. And the good news is that there's a lot of good social science and a lot of the history of community practice that tells us there are some good things about how you do that. And if people will get skilled in that, right, then they become more confident in their ability to do it, and it allows us to bring more champions to some of the work that we're doing. So this is about how you bring more champions to the table, how you get people organized and invested and excited, because you understand that it's not that folks don't want to be, or they're apathetic. It's not that. It's that they're demoralized, and this is a moment to get them excited again.
Yeah, and one of the examples of that you cited in the book was President Kennedy. Is really how you start the book off with President Kennedy seeing Sputnik go up, and figuring out a way to push the nation to get behind funding NASA and then eventually putting a man on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a perfect illustration. You have others, of course, but I thought that's a
Mm-hmm.
perfect illustration of what you just talked about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Break down the difference between a technical solution and an adaptive solution.
Yeah, so I talk in my book about, really what case making requires is really, I would say what this moment requires are adaptive leaders because the world is changing so fast, and so dramatically that if we don't have folks who are able to, right, to look into the world that we have very quickly, assess what's happening, and then be able to turn on a dime and bring other people forward, it won't be leadership, right, that actually moves us forward. So being able to be adaptive in the world that we live in is a huge skill set, right, of which case making is one. Adaptive leaders are able to tell the difference between technical challenges they're looking at and ones that really are adaptive. Technical challenges are things that, they just need a technical fix. So I give the example in the book, if you're in a coffee shop or something and somehow the Wi-Fi drops for a second or there's something happens and maybe, you can fix that. Maybe it's, you can troubleshoot that. Maybe you go and unplug the router and replug it back in, or you reconnect to a different network or whatever that is. That's a technical challenge that just needs to be, right. A little bit of technical skill can change that. An adaptive skill, right, and thinking about that is the fact that we have large swaths of the United States, particularly poorer communities, rural communities, and communities of color that don't have access to high-speed broadband in a world where 90% of the business environment is conducted over, right, the internet. If you don't have access, right, to those kinds of technologies, you are literally locked out of economic possibilities, right? That could get you, because that could feed your family. That's an adaptive challenge. The world is changing. Before it was, if you didn't have, internet at the very beginning of the internet, who cared, right? You could still conduct business. You could still apply for a job, right? You went down to the place, you knocked on the door, you said, do you have any openings, right? And that was the way that business was conducted. Now it's different. You don't walk even into a Target and say, do you have any job applications? They'll tell you, what will they tell you? Go online. Yeah, go online. We don't conduct business that way. And so if you're in a position where you don't have access, that you are literally locked out of the most basic kinds of economic opportunity, including things like applying for jobs, that's an adaptive challenge. The world has changed. And wherever you live, if you don't have that kind of high speed broadband, you're locked out. The same thing, right? If you look at what's happening technologically, with automated cars, very, shortly, we'll have driverless cars everywhere. They've been piloted in about 40 different cities right now, driverless cars. And in order to have driverless cars function, you have to have what's called edge technology, which essentially allows the computer in your car to talk to the computers that are, right, the satellites and computers are around, right, your city. So if you're in a city or in a part of the country that doesn't have that technology, you're going to be locked out of essentially the next phase of technology. That's an adaptive challenge, folks. The world is changing. The leaders in your community have to say, hey, folks, we're not going to be locked out. So the question is, how do we plug into the economy that's coming? And if they're not saying that, if they're not thinking strategically about how to adapt, right, to the world that's coming, then you're going to be locked out. And that's what I try and talk about in the book. It's not a lot of the challenges that are really most important, not always the technical ones, it's the adaptive ones, right, that leave us behind if we're not very thoughtful.
So, give me an example of a characteristic of an adaptive leader.
Yeah. So in the book, I give a whole section on just the kind of the characteristics of what it takes to be an adaptive leader. One is to be somebody who is always thinking about systems rather than, I would say, charity or services. It means that, workforce development and things like even the technology I just talked about, those are systems. Ed technology are systems, right? So having somebody who understands how systems operates is really important. And most of us have no clue. And so adaptive leaders get real thoughtful and careful about how systems operate. So I do a lot of work, for example, in the housing market and our housing system. And it's amazing to me how although lots of us are not happy with what's happening in terms of the cost of housing, which is going up very quickly, it is the single largest driver of inflation right now. So we all know that because we're feeling it in our pocket. But it's amazing how few of us know how homes actually get built, right? I think most of us think that, like, a builder or developer or architect decides that I want to build a home, and they go to that Home Depot, they get the materials, they get there, and that's actually not, that's the simplistic way. It's actually not how most homes get built. But because we don't understand the system for how that happens, right? All the way from the inception of the house and the thoughtfulness about where it could be, or land use decisions in your community, because we don't understand that, we don't actually understand how to participate in making that housing system better. So the only thing we can say is housing is expensive. Okay, but why is it that what's happening in the system that's driving that? But we don't know. So adaptive leaders get all into the systems. They want to know how the thing operates. How are land use decisions made in this community? Because you can't just plop a home anywhere you want to. Who makes those decisions? There's a planning board, right? There's a city planning that actually makes decisions long before you even decide that you want to build something. They've already made some decisions about where you can build, how you can build, how high it has to be, how wide it has to be, what the parameters are, what you need to do, like what the regulations are, who can do it, what you need a permit to do, like all these things, right? That are really important. And once you understand those systems, you understand how to unlock, right, the parts of it that are necessary for our survival. So systems leaders, adaptive leaders are systems thinkers. They invite public deliberation. They think about root causes of challenges like racism, sexism. They think about that and how those things are woven into systems. They focus on solutions, but they're not problem oriented. Like, listen, I got a million problems. I don't need one more of those. What I do need are some good solutions, right? That are feasible, thoughtful, that work, all that stuff. They're data informed. They are visionaries. They can help to build a vision around something even before other people have figured it out, right? They're visionaries. So, and I think about like some of the technology folks, I mean, I sometimes go on the internet and you watch some of these technologists when they were early on, when they were talking about, like when Bill Gates was talking about the internet. And he was trying to convince like David Letterman and other folks when he was going on these shows talking about this thing that was coming called the internet. And folks were laughing at him like, what are you talking about? You don't need electronic mail. You can just put a mail in the mailbox. What do y'all take, right? Because people didn't have the vision yet, right? But Bill Gates was like, you just wait. And now he wasn't the only one. There were many folks in the technology space, but trying to create the vision for what this could be, even before other people could see it. Adaptive leaders can see the vision even before, right? Most people can see it. And I like to, always use the quote sometime about that. When you bring new ideas to the table, first they laugh at you, right? Then they threaten you and they get nervous. They try to fight you because they're like, oh Lord, this is really right. Right. Then they get nervous and then you win, right? Because over time, right, the ideas that are not just good but powerful, right? At first, like, what are you talking about? Folks laugh at you. And literally, folks were laughing Bill Gates and the rest of these folks out of the room, like, you are out of your mind. What kind of electronic mail in the air? What are you talking about? And now look at that, right? Or even when Apple announced they were doing the iPad, and people are like, what the hell do you need an iPad for? What are you talking about? You're gonna be banking on your phone. Who does that? And now, if you take somebody's phone away from them for 20 minutes, it's like, they get upset like the world has come to an end. Where's my phone? Where's my phone? Right. And so that's, I think, the characteristic of some of the characteristics of adaptive leaders. They see the vision even before other people's even catch the fire.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the phone thing. Briefly explain the 10 strategic case-making principles.
Yeah. So there are 10 principles. I say in my book that there are 10 principles that, if you lean into those principles, will help you make the case for the kinds of big vision that you may have. So in that case, I was using Bill Gates. I certainly used Kennedy. There are lots of folks, Martin Luther King, other folks who are trying to do big things. How do you get people to be invested in that? The first principle of that is having people have a sense of stake in what you're talking about. So connecting to people's aspirations. What is it at the highest levels of their lives that they want for themselves? And you want to connect to people in that way, because ultimately the thing that pulls people forward is the aspiration they have for their own lives, right? When I feel like, for me, it would be, issues around the well-being of my children. From my vantage point, if you want to get me to do anything, you tell me that that it has an impact on the future of my kids. If you're telling me that the future of my children is wrapped up in how we solve this issue or that issue or whatever issue it is, yeah, I'm coming to the meeting. What time is the meeting? I want to be there. Because for me, that is the most important thing to me. For others, it may be something else, but whatever is that aspiration that people have, you wanna knock on that. And there are other things like naming the power of the moment, like getting people really present to why this is the moment to do something big, not yesterday, not tomorrow, today, and being able to make that case effectively. And then I would say things like telling people what they lose if they don't join you. So what do I lose? If I don't join you and I never decide to follow you or support the work that you're doing, if I never come on your podcast, if I never, decide to support you and helping you build your business, if I never do that, so what? And if you can't tell me that something like amazing, I'm going to miss out on something that's amazing, I'm going to lose something really tangible, right? Then you've lost the opportunity to sort of pull me forward. So I won't go through all of the 10 principles, but I think that each one of the principles is built around a large history of the social sciences in terms of what persuades people to do things when they're hard. And what is it that persuades people to move their feet when they really don't necessarily want to, or they may be afraid to? Those are the things that are packed into those principles that sort of help people move forward. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And that was a good way to tease it to get people to buy the book, and we'll tell people how to do that later. Talk about how the toxic culture of political partisanship and polarization constrains case making.
Yeah, I don't know that it constrains case making, but I do think it constrains people's willingness to engage in the kind of conversations that we really need to have. Like, for example, I'm now teaching for those who are interested, I'm teaching a summer course, a free summer course online that they go to my website, TheCaseMade.com, they can sign up for it. But it's a conversation about what I call the racial runway, which is how to talk about race at a time when lots of folks are living in places where you're not supposed to talk about race. I live in Florida right now. The governor in our state has fired anybody with a diversity in their title, in their job description, anything related to DEI, period, fired, gone, without even, with no consequence to their families, without any thoughtfulness about what it is they bring to the table. And so I think in a lot of places, it's made people reticent to even start to have the conversations. And that's exactly what, by the way, that was designed to do, right? It was designed to make people fearful to have the important conversations about race. So in this environment where it's so toxic, that's so toxic, right? The question people may be having is, then how do I engage, particularly when I'm in rooms where they're multiracial, where not everybody has the same perspective on issues like race? How do I still have a conversation that's meaningful about something that is really meaningful, like race? So I'm teaching a free summer course to get people to understand how to get people on what I call the racial runway, to get them back in the conversation in ways that are constructive and productive. So I don't know that having a toxic culture necessarily constrains case making, but it certainly makes people a little more reticent to bring up those important conversations. And what case making should do is help you get those conversations back on track. Because to my mind, we're going to have the conversation. Like, you got too many folks around the country and indeed around the world who now really truly understand, right? I think the history of where we've come from, and are not about to be quiet about that. This is right where I think we've come too far not to have those conversations that may be difficult to have, but need to be had. So yeah, the environment may be toxic, but our response has to be better. So how about that?
That sounds good to me. And I appreciate that positive energy. I really do, and that's why I asked that question at near the beginning of the interview, because part of that ability to be a leader in this time is that you have to have that positive energy. So
Mhm.
talk about the organization itself. What is the CaseMade, and what is the mission of the CaseMade?
Absolutely. So the mission of the Case Made is really to equip everyday folks with the skill sets they need to change the world, right? And when I say that, it means to have not just the conversations that are tough, but to begin to grow the field of champions who are championing social justice, whether it's racial, gender oriented, whether it's housing, whether it's childcare, whatever it is. There's just an enormous amount opportunity in this moment to move forward, right? To continue to make progress on these issues. And our organization trains folks how to do that effectively, thoughtfully, and constructively. We do that through a number of things. Sometimes they're individual. We'll come to conferences and keynotes and do stuff like that. But also we run things like a 6-week training on like some of the racial runway stuff or some of the just the basic skill sets and the 10 principles that I shared. We do that for individuals and groups. And again, our the goal at the end of the day is really to help people become really confident in the way that they engage in these conversations. So you can talk to anybody, regardless of how toxic the culture may be in your organization or in your community, and cut through some of that to get the folks who are willing and ready to champion the work. And if folks are interested in that, again, www.thecasemade.com is where we are located.
All right. And the name of the book is Case Made: 10 Powerful Leadership Principles That Win Hearts, Change Minds, and Grow Impact. And this is, excuse me, this is the revised edition. I think you wrote the first book like in 2020, something like that.
Yep.
So how do people get the book? And then outside of going to the website, how can people get in touch with you to get you to come and talk about different things?
Absolutely. So the book they can get on Amazon.com, just Case Made is the title. So you can look that up pretty easily. And if folks want to engage me, the best way for me, I have a bunch of media handles, so you can catch me on, LinkedIn and Tiffany Manuel, or, Instagram, Dr. Tiffany Manuel. But the best way to get to me usually is through my website. If you can do a contact sheet at talk to us at thecasemade.com, all that stuff comes to me, and I'll be happy to talk to folks about the work that we do and how it can contribute to the work that other folks are doing.
All right. So, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, first of all, thank you for coming on. But I do have a confession. I really had a selfish reason to have you on, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Is that I like to be around people, even though they're human and they go through the same feelings and stuff, especially being an African American.
Mm-hmm.
But you come across as somebody that's like, okay, that was your best shot. All right. So here's my counter. I'm gonna give you love. I'm gonna give you positive energy, and I'm gonna give you a solution to your problem. And we
Mm-hmm.
don't have a lot of people like that, brothers and sisters in the community. So
Mm-hmm.
because they become victims. Dr. King even talked about how we
Yeah.
hoped against hope, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so to connect with you, to have you connect with my audience, and for you to be doing the work that you're doing, I greatly appreciate it, and I sincerely thank you for connecting with me and again being on the podcast.
I love it. Thank you so much. And what you just said, listen, that is a whole meal and an entree right there. Let me tell you, we could go for a whole another half an hour about that alone. But I appreciate you saying that, because I think that's exactly right. We're not gonna hope against hope. Come on, y'all. We have come too far. Don't lay down the baton and say you're tired. Come on, folk. Come on, y'all. And the thing is, the work is not easy and it's not pretty. It's messy. Nobody has the answer to any of the stuff, but we're figuring it out. So, rather than be, a sort of negative naysayer, do your part. Whatever that is, max out. Whatever your lane is, max it out. Like, do whatever you can in whatever way you can. And if you do that, right, then you are lifting up like the ancestors. That's what I think.
All right, guys. With that, we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, and her name is Rachael Keri Williams. Rachael Keri Williams is the executive director of SOAL, Saving Our Ancestors' Legacy. SOAL was formed in the summer of 2021 by descendants of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania's oldest remaining historically black burial ground, Lincoln Cemetery. SOAL's mission is to work together to save their ancestors' legacy, document and speak their names, rebury the dead, and restore Lincoln Cemetery. SOAL seeks to restore the cemetery through conservation and preservation work on site, public history research, and the digital humanities. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Rachael Keri Williams. All right, Rachael Keri Williams. How you doing, sister? You doing good?
I'm good. Yes.
Well,
It's a beautiful day.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm glad it's not too hot where you are, is it?
Not too hot today. There's a good wind blowing, so you can keep a little cool.
I got you. Yeah, I'm down here in Atlanta, so it's living up to the hot Atlanta name. But I love hot weather, so it's all good. Look, there's two things I want to do to get started as we get into the work that you're doing. The first thing I want to do is give you a quote, and this is what I do with all the guests. And your quote is, "Black people are missing from U.S. history, and it's not because they weren't there. For me, it's about recovering and restoring that part of our history and knowing who we are." What does that quote mean to you?
For most of my life, and I think a lot of people, that what we're taught about our history doesn't include us, and that it's because we've been left out, because we've been, definitely not even kind of erased from that history, and that there is a chance for us to put our people back into the past, into the American story. And we do that by reclaiming all the names and stories that have been forgotten and not told over the past couple hundred years.
So, first things first, talk to me about Williams Hall at the University of Maine. Talk to me about your connection with that.
So my grandmother, Beryl Warner Williams, she was born and raised in Bangor, Maine, and she was the first Black woman to get a graduate degree. And she got her undergraduate and graduate degree from UMaine. And they reached out a few years ago and said, they had a building there called C.C. Little Hall that was named for a past president of UMaine who was a eugenicist. And they chose to rename that building after my grandmother. And I became part of that committee, and I really wanted it to just not be a situation where they slapped a new name on an old building. I wanted it to honor the history of Black Mainers and also acknowledge this history of this eugenicist, because that practice greatly affected my grandmother's life. She had her uterus removed accidentally after giving birth to my father, and so she was unable to have more children, but that was directly tied to eugenics.
Yeah. So
yeah,
when you were putting this together, was that what led you to going to Lincoln Cemetery and creating SOAL, the organization?
So, everything kind of came together all at once. My mother died when I was 19 years old, and she lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and I went down there with my dad, and we went through the house, and we're looking for things that we needed to take back to Buffalo, New York, and I found hidden in the behind a panel in the basement, family history letters and photos that went back to the mid 1800s. And that started me really on my journey of, documenting and researching our family history, which led me to remembering back in 2021, my grandmother saying that my grandfather, who's buried here, my grandmother's buried in Maine, my grandfather was surrounded by his brothers that he fought in battle with and his family. And I was like, what family is that? Like, I don't know what family is buried down there by him. So I came down here, and, my grandma's words about remembering our history and telling these stories have carried me through
Now,
the journey.
I'm saying, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, just that she's carried me through that and helped to, encourage me to put all these pieces together, like I'm quilting.
So when you say here, you're talking about Lincoln Cemetery in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And from my
Correct.
research, in getting ready for this interview, it is the oldest black cemetery in Harrisburg.
Yes, oldest remaining black cemetery. So there were 4 or 5 earlier black cemeteries, the earliest in 1700s, and they all got moved to varying degrees to Lincoln Cemetery, which was established in 1877. So we have burials that go back to the 1700s, but they weren't buried here originally.
Now, and there's kind of a misnomer, because like if you go to the cemetery, there's like this big gate and it says 1827, but the cemetery actually didn't become organized or official until 1877. Kind of explain the nuance about that.
What we think happened is that it was like someone misread a piece of paper, and it looked like a 7, and it was, or 2, but it was actually a 7. That's the best that we can figure out about the 1827 date.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Especially if you read my handwriting, you probably would make that mistake. So first of all, did you find your folks when you
I did not.
So you're still looking for them?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I found my grandfather,
okay,
and his sister, and his parents are also, buried right by them. And I actually found another second great grandmother. I just didn't find the people who I came here looking for specifically. So that is, I mean, I have recovered, hundreds and hundreds of headstones that are sunken and under the ground since in the last 3 years. And then we've also added, I think, over 4,500 names to the Find a Grave database and records for the cemetery. So I have a ways to go.
Yeah, because reportedly it's about 10,000.
At least.
Yeah. 10,000 is supposed to be buried. So what's been some of the cool discoveries that Souls made during this restoration process?
Definitely, I mean, for me, some of the stories of some of the people and enslaved people, getting to understand a lot more about slavery in Pennsylvania and the ways even just like people escaping slavery, and then that they had slave reunions after freedom came, and finding these. So I found this headstone, Jane Cooper, and it turns out that this headstone that I found, it verified for the family's descendants this story that, their grandfather had written down in the early 1900s about his father, that he escaped slavery and then in Virginia, and then went back and found all of his family members. He went to slaveholders, took them to court. He had to get his kids back from Mississippi because they had taken them to Mississippi after he escaped. And he brought his mother back to Harrisburg, and she died. And the family did not really believe that he had done all this. And then I found her headstone here. So that is like, that story, it affirms so much in terms of their family line, their history, their strength. But I think it does for the rest of us too. Like that you can recover this past. You can recover it by recovering a headstone, and he recovered his family by going and getting them back and taking slaveholders to court. So
yeah, and that's actually really, really cool. I noticed one of the things was that you've been able to find like 80 Union soldiers and be able to identify them, and some of them you've on your website you've posted their stories and stuff.
yeah, I mean, United States Colored Troops and Mass, the 54th, 55th Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, infantries as well. We have over 147 United States Colored Troops buried here right now, but we find them on a regular basis, additional ones. So that's amazing to learn so much about their stories and their histories too.
Yeah, that I mean, I've been to uh, uh, ceremonies where they actually transferred some colored soldiers to a grave site, a national. I'm trying to say the national cemetery. Yeah, so there's a national cemetery in Port Gibson, Mississippi, and they found, I forgot how many it was. I want to say 8, and so they interned them at that cemetery. And the ironic thing is, one of the groups that helped make that happen was the Sons of Confederate Veterans, if you believe it or
Wow.
not. Yeah, because I was their guest of all things. They said, Fleming, come on down. We'll bring you down to that. Yeah. So yeah, welcome to Mississippi. Anyway, why do you think that these black cemeteries were neglected? Just Rachael Williams. What was on your mind as far as why do you think this has happened?
I mean, I think that we, as a people, we're dealing with a lot and have been for the whole time, and with the destruction of communities and those places of power here in Harrisburg. The neighborhoods, all of the old black neighborhoods, don't exist anymore. The ones from the 1900s, they were developed on, and breaking apart those communities, people get busy trying to fight systemic racism, and you are trying to stay alive. You're not as worried about the dead. And so that's kind of what's happened over the years. They're also not, black cemeteries aren't funded. So we have pretty much paid for all of the stuff, the restoration that we've done here ourselves out of our pockets. So even though we have, over 350 veterans of all wars buried here, we don't get funding from the military or the government like a national cemetery does to maintain headstones or the grounds or anything.
Yeah. This guy, Brent Leggs, I don't know if you've met him or not, but he's the executive. So you've met Brett?
Yes.
Okay. And for the audience, he's the executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Fund. He said that when sites of sacred cultural memory are desecrated, it adds additional trauma to the indignity of being segregated even in death. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Like when I came here and uh, looking for my second great grandparents, I found the cemetery was completely overgrown. There were weeds everywhere, but I also found human bones on the ground and coffin handles throughout the cemetery. And it was the trauma of seeing that made it, because I live in Buffalo, New York. So like that made it like it didn't matter that I have a 5 hour drive. I have to keep coming back. I can't have that. It's like this, people's bodies were bought and sold, like they were owned, and then these are the same people, and then they have their bones just splayed out on the ground. Like that's not something that that I could let go, and then the threats of people wanting to come and take those bones and add them to their collection and make jewelry out of them and stuff like that was it's too much. I believe we can heal the trauma of those things by healing these places and connecting with our roots.
Yeah. Yeah, because we had a similar situation. When I went to Jackson State, there was a cemetery like right down the street, and it was right across from the Masonic Temple. And so like the Masons would go over and kind of mow the lawn in a little bit, but they didn't really do any upkeep with the headstones and all that stuff. So fortunately, when the university started expanding, one of the things they requested was money to, because they're the headquarters for COFO, which was a kind of like the consolidating group for all of the civil rights groups in Mississippi at the time. Their headquarters is right next to the cemetery. So Jackson State put in money to not only restore the COFO headquarters, but since the cemetery is right next to it, to do that. So that cemetery has been restored, and that was state funds. And I think there was some federal dollars in there, but primarily state funds that was able to do that. But that was just kind of like the university saying, okay, we're expanding. This is a part of the community, and we're going to put some money into it to preserve it. But there's a number of cemeteries in the vicinity of Jackson State that they're not involved with. They're more like what you're dealing with Lincoln Cemetery. But I've noticed when that there's been stories like the Deltas went on a mission to find one of their founders at a cemetery in D.C., and ended up not only finding one of their founders, but two of the AKA founders in that same cemetery. And so they've put together a group to actually do that. And I've noticed that there's kind of a trend. Why do you think that there is a movement now to restore these Black cemeteries?
And I think that it's been building for a while, but that there's generally a movement to tell more of our stories. And when you start to go look for who your founder is, whether it's your church or your organization or a school, an HBCU, that this is the place where you're going to have to come to really uncover that story. You're going to have to go to a Black cemetery, and going there, and then the increased interest also for individuals like with me, that you've got your DNA testing, and now you're putting your family history together. You're gonna find yourself going to a Black cemetery to find out, well, who are their other family members? Who's that next generation? What can I learn? And those records are here. And it's, one of those primary source records. It is one of the greatest primary source records for Black history, because a lot of times our names don't show up other places.
Yeah. So I remember, too, there was a lady that taught at Jackson State, and her name was Alfredine Harrison. And she had a group of kids from a local high school there. She had found the grave of the only black man to ever serve in a statewide office in Mississippi. His name was James Lynch, and he was the Secretary of State. So she found his grave, and his grave is in the oldest cemetery in the city, and it's right behind the Capitol building, but it was in disrepair. And so she got some students together and they've redone it. And when you see it, first of all, when you see it, you'll notice it's probably the prettiest monument there because, it's been kept up. But I mean, just the detail, it's like his face is on the monument. I mean, just all sorts of stuff. And, so that kind of piqued my interest. But one of the things that I always tell people, whether, I grew up in Chicago. I lived in Mississippi for 30 some odd years, and now I'm in Atlanta. And one of the things I tried to do in every city I lived in was to visit the cemetery. And I try to find the oldest cemetery because I'm a history buff. So when I see certain headstones, I say, okay, that street's named after this person, and this street is named after that. And you can start putting the story together of a city based on the oldest cemetery or the most prominent cemetery in the town. So from what I'm hearing from you, that's kind of the same thing with us in Black history, that we can start putting these stories together, not just for our families, but the communities that existed in these particular towns. And I guess with certain testing and all that stuff, and, you can find out how they lived and all that kind of stuff.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's, when you are trying to just piece together a community with, just, you're just relying on, okay, who's a person who knows people that were prominent in the Black community. And then you're kind of always going to come up with the same names. And now, like, especially when we're talking about the early 1800s, there's no one left alive who has a memory of those people being alive. So you are removed too many generations. The names aren't necessarily passed down. When you come to a Black cemetery, like here at Lincoln, we have family plots and people that lived next to each other. It's like they all bought plots at the same time. So they're even laid out according to where people lived in the community. Like your next door neighbor would get a plot, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to go get myself a plot tomorrow, and so they're all kind of like together. And people lived next to each other based on where they originally came from as well. So people move by people. So then you get another generation back, even from, those people who were like recorded on the census in the 1850s. You can go back another generation. You start to see their names together in newspaper articles, and then to look up those people's names, and you get more and more and more information about who people were, how they lived, what they did, and that fills in our past.
Yeah. That's so cool. That's neat. That's kind of a nuanced thing. I knew about us as Black folks living in certain communities together, first by choice in some cases, and then a lot of times by redlining. But, you live next to this person, now you're buried next to this person too. I didn't think it carried that far. Yeah. But
yeah. I mean, you travel together for protection, right? It's like that was people went where their people were because that's what they had information about, and they were safer that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So you talked about money. Now, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act was signed into law as part of fiscal year 2023's omnibus spending package. And it established a program at the National Park Service to provide technical competitive grants and technical assistance to local partners to research, identify, survey, and preserve these cemeteries. One, how important is it for the U.S. government to assist in the work that you and others around the country are doing? And two, have you gotten some of this money?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. I mean, we are a part of American history. We're the part that's never been included or told. Uh, Unfortunately, that the fund has not been funded, so there is no money yet from the government for this, which is kind of indicative of the way things go. That yes, I mean 3 million is not even enough to begin with, when we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of Black cemeteries that have never had any funding or work or money put into them, and all the Confederate monuments and cemeteries are well maintained, and ours are not. So 3 million would not cut it, but we didn't even get 3 million yet.
Right. And that was going to be my next question. It was like, because I understood it was only $3 million. And of course, so, I was a legislator at one point in Mississippi. And so when I see numbers and I'm thinking, from Congress, I'm like, 3 million is not even 1% of the federal budget. And, and I appreciate Senator Brown for getting that through, because he visited a black cemetery in Cincinnati and was aghast by how it was. So that's what motivated him to do it. But $3 million, like you said, is like a drop in the bucket, to try to get the tools and everything else you need to do the job right. Because right now you just have an army of volunteers that come out.
Right.
Just kind of explain like a typical day, how that works as far as what y'all do.
Yeah, I mean, we have it drop in. So, like, we come down from Buffalo, New York, and I'm usually here more often than like the volunteer team. But once a month, we have 3 days where you're all day. People come in. We're identifying the headstones that are most in need of being repaired. So we have, old marble headstones. Sometimes they're cracked in multiple pieces, or they're on top of bases and they've been knocked off. The base may be broken, and then we dig out a new foundation, put sand and gravel in, and repair the headstone however it needs to be repaired according to the best practices for doing that. You want to make sure that any repair that you do fails, like that it's weaker than the stone itself. So that way, if something happens to stone and gets knocked over by a lawnmower, then your repair is going to break. The stone's not going to break in a new place. So that's been like one of the biggest things that we've learned is, like, in the past, people used a lot of concrete and would set a stone in concrete, and that breaks the stone if that stone gets knocked into. So we try to do something that's going to break the repair, not break the stone, but last a long time.
Yeah. And there's some other nuanced things, because I noticed on the website you teach people how to remove paint and all that stuff from the headstones and all that. So
Yeah.
so we're at the part of the interview where it's time to plug what you're doing. So it's like, if people want to volunteer, if people want to donate, or just get more information, go ahead and tell the folks how they can do that.
Yeah, I mean, please donate. We need as much support as we can get. We just found out that we did not get some funding that we were hoping to get this year, so we are at cash zero. You can find out about what we do at lincolncemetery.org. Read the blog. You can join our Facebook group. You can come out if you're in Harrisburg. But please go to lincolncemetery.org. Donate, follow like Leisha on TikTok, follow our Instagram, share information stories with everybody you know.
Yeah. Now, do you go out and talk to people about restorations, or just your story of your journey and all that? And if you do, how can people reach out to you?
Yeah, they can reach me through email, and I do talks and presentations. I've got one coming up for Juneteenth celebration here in Harrisburg called Death, Tech, and Afrofuturism, and that will be on the 18th of June. And I can, also be reached at 727, I think no, I forgot it. No, forgot the number now. But email me.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't tell people not to give your phone numbers out, but maybe that was God saying, "Hey, look, don't get that number out. Just,
Don't do that. I
just,
will.
just, just do the email thing."
Yes.
Well,
And that's Rachael, Rachael at lincolncemetery.org.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Rachael, when I came across you on LinkedIn, and of course you were kind of like going, "Why does this guy want me on the podcast?" This is an incredible story. This is something that, and it's not just you. You know what I'm saying? There's other organizations, there's other individuals that try. I mean, they found at an Air Force base, they found like 180 something graves of African Americans at an Air Force base that they basically, fortunately, it wasn't a landing strip or anything. It was some area that had to be clear so there wouldn't be obstructions for the planes. But still, it's just, and New York City is basically built over, like Central Park is based over a black village, right?
Yeah.
And so, for
And cemetery, there was a cemetery there too. So.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, it's just like when, so I when I reached out to you, I was like saying this would be good to kind of tell her story, but also to tell a story that needs to get more emphasis. And I am glad that you pointed out the fact that while y'all in Congress sitting up here arguing about needles and all this other stuff, y'all need to fund stuff that y'all approve of. Even if it's just $3 million, put the money in the budget. Amen.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like it coming around. I like to say I believe that people. It's easier for people to care about dead people than it is for them to care about living people, and that it's something that you could come around, like come together around, is understanding. Oh, okay, Black dead people are people, and then Black people are people. But it's easier sometimes for people to accept, just like you're saying, Sons of Confederate Veterans went and honored these Black Civil War soldiers. It's an easier way to heal is going through that. That is the power of the dead, is that they can bring us together. And so I think that it's definitely important for the government to be funding this, because our country needs some healing.
Yes, it does. All right. Well, Rachael, I'm gonna make that the final word on this. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and keep doing what you're doing, and much success in being able to not only restore dignity to those families, but to also uncover some stories that we need to hear.
Thank you. Thank you for having me very much. Yes.
All right, guys, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So I want to thank, in closing, Dr. Tiffany Manuel and Rachael Keri Williams for coming on the podcast. Again, it's just awesome that to have a platform in order to highlight some things that are going on in our communities. And, people get recognition, and a lot of times they get it in their local communities or in their circle. But to be able to broaden that horizon and have a vehicle to do that is really, really a blessing. So again, I thank them for coming on, and I'm thankful to you all, the listeners, for making this possible. You know, my show is not the smoothest show, and when I say that, I say it because this is totally unscripted. I don't sit down and write out what I'm going to talk about, or and it's just on availability when I can have guests. So prior to, it's not like, okay, I'm going to have this show and that show and that show and all that stuff. Now, hopefully, as we are getting into closer to election season, I'm going to try to get guests on that are more focused on the election piece of it, and highlight them. But, I'm going to probably also have some guests that are not directly related to the election, but they're going to cover some issues that need to be highlighted in this political space. And again, when the people that I'm uplifting are doing work, and everything, politics touches everything, right? So you heard, like, we're with Rachael Williams. Well, what does that have to? What does the cemetery restoration have to do with government? And you heard, it's like the federal government allocated $3 million. Well, they put it on paper that they were going to get $3 million, and they haven't spent the money yet for whatever reason, right? But politics determines the people who make those decisions, right? The person who came up with the legislation was elected. The people who vote on the legislation are elected, right? When you're talking about Dr. Manuel, and basically her whole premise is to create leaders and give leaders the tools to do what they need to do to make decisions, like helping sisters out like Rachael Williams, right? So again, it doesn't matter what you do. I don't care if you bake cookies. I don't care if you are a crossing guard. I don't care if you are a professional wrestler, right? Or MMA fighter. Government and politics has something to do with everything, right? What is an MMA fighter? Bruh, it's like the commissions that are set up in each state are government entities. They give you a license to fight in those particular states. That's government, right? So again, I'm not going to go into a whole civics lesson, everything. But the reason why I say I brought up the point about unscripted is, real quick, my favorite black U.S. congressman now, because he's getting to the point where I'm mentioning him like B6, right? And you know who I'm talking about when I say B6. But anyway, the congresswoman from Georgia, if y'all didn't make that connection. Byron Donalds was in his element, right? And he got out there and was trying to, so this is what he was trying to say. He was trying to make the argument that even during the worst period of American history for black folks, right, that one of the strengths of the black community was the family unit. And that's how, we got through. And it wasn't just the nuclear family, mom, dad, children. It was grandparents were, ancestors were connected in that unit, sometimes in-laws, right? Sometimes aunties and uncles were all part of that family unit in that household. And so everybody had to pull their weight with, with segregation and low wages and, basic laws that made black people second-class citizens. the family unit kept folks together, and that family unit extended out to community, and that gave, and then when it reached into the church, then that gave us the vehicle to fight, right? So the argument that Donald was trying to make was that programs that Democrats like Lyndon Johnson and others were pushing with the Great Society and all that has done damage to the black family as opposed to help it. The war on poverty didn't work, is what he was trying to say, right? And so Republicans are the answer, because the Republican philosophy of conservatism about, low taxes and big business and all that stuff, they believe that's the solution. And less government programs, more opportunities for people to excel individually. That's the argument he was trying to make. The way it came out was Jim Crow wasn't all that bad because we had family. So the reason why I mentioned it is unscripted, because that was unscripted, right? He was in a group of folks that he was comfortable with. He was in a group of black Republicans. So he just, he wasn't careful with what he was saying. He just said what was on his mind and said it in a way where he wasn't talking for a long period of time. He was just trying to address something. So I get it. But the danger is when you are a black elected official, and I've had to deal with it personally, other black elected officials had to deal with it personally, everything that we say is monitored. Everything that we say is parsed. Everything that we say is scrutinized. And we were even taught to read between the lines of what politicians say, right? So you have to be careful. When he gets out there and tries to bash the criminal justice system by saying the juror, attacking the jurors, there ain't no getting around that. That was terrible. Don't do that no more, right? That's, because the jury system, as I stated last week, is something that we were trying to get more black people into, not disparage it, right? We want you to register to vote. We want you to participate in the elections, and we want you to go to jury duty. But, I'm not going to try to crucify him over what some people can say is a legitimate argument. Are we better off as a family unit with the government programs that were implemented during the 1960s or not? And there was a stretch where you could make the argument that we were not, because of certain bureaucracies and certain rules, right, that punish families for being families. And with the reforms that happened during the Clinton administration and all that, we kind of got away from that. But, I understood where the argument was coming from. What I don't like is, because he said it the way he said it, there are certain white folks and certain black folks that are going to parrot what he said, and leading up to people like Ron DeSantis saying, see, Jim Crow wasn't bad. Slavery, you actually learned valuable skills, right? It falls, the way he said it falls in that category. So it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent. If you are a black person, be mindful. I get it. You're going to have a moment that's unscripted. You're answering a question, and it may not come across the way you want it to come across. I'm not going to crucify you for it. But I do want you to understand how it came across. And basically, when I've watched him try to defend what he said, he hasn't been apologetic about it. He hasn't said, that was not my intention. Don't ever think, as a black man, that I would think that Jim Crow was okay. Never said that. I think Joy Reid kind of pushed a little bit out of him in the last interview he did with her, but, you know, he wanted to blame the media and the Democrats for taking it a certain way. But people took it. It doesn't matter what their political affiliation is and all that. There are black people that are very, very upset with the way it came out. And so contrition, which is something that is really, really lacking in American politics now, especially with the Republican nominee for president. Contrition needs to be part of the character development of elected leaders. I got criticized for saying I'm sorry, right? And my response was, I'm sorry you feel that way, right? I'm not going to lose that aspect of my humanity because you don't want to hear me say I'm sorry. As a matter of fact, I would rather to hear politicians say that I'm sorry than act the way that these politicians are acting now, with no contrition, no shame, no remorse. Understand that we're going to say some things that don't quite hit the mark. Comedians run into that all the time. There are jokes that don't work, right? So you just press on. You keep doing the good work. You apologize for offending anyone and just move on. You're human. We make mistakes. Just admit it when it happens. Until next time.